Before there were countries like we know them today, there were just kingdoms. And before we were citizens, people were subjects. We're about to get into the story of a single idea that completely redrew the map of Europe and really shaped the entire modern world, the idea of nationalism. Let's dive in. So it all starts with a dream, really. Just look at this print from 1848 by a French artist named Frédéric Souriau. This right here, this is the original hopeful promise of nationalism. I mean, if you look closely, you can see people from all over Europe, even America, and they're not subjects of warring kings. They're this united family of nations, marching together past a Statue of Liberty into some kind of shared, peaceful future. It's an incredible, almost utopian vision, right? And that brings us to the big, central question of this whole story. How on earth did we get from that beautiful, hopeful procession to the brutal, muddy trenches of World War I? That's the journey we're going to unpack right now, from idealism to absolute catastrophe. Okay, to really get just how revolutionary this idea was, we have to kind of rewind. We need to understand the world it was born into. Because before nation-states, Europe was this patchwork of empires and kingdoms. It was a very, very different world than the one we live in. So on one side, you had the old model, the dynastic empire. Think of something like the Habsburg Empire. It was this huge, sprawling collection of all kinds of different people. You had Germans, Hungarians, Italians, all speaking different languages, living totally different lives. The only thing that really held them together was their shared loyalty to one guy, the emperor. But then this totally radical new idea comes along, the nation-state. And here, the power wasn't with a king. It was with the citizens themselves, all supposedly bound together by a common culture, a shared history, a real identity. And these empires, they were usually absolutist. It's a fancy word, but it just means a monarch with total, unrestrained, absolute power. This was the system the first nationalists were trying to tear down. See, they didn't just want to swap out one ruler for another. They wanted to change the entire game of how power worked. So, a dream is one thing. But where did this explosive idea actually turn into reality? Well, for that, we've got to go to the streets of Paris in the late 18th century. We've got to talk about the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries didn't just talk about the nation, man, they built it step by step. First things first, they took sovereignty, the right to rule, away from the monarch and gave it to the French citizens. Then they cooked up a whole new identity. You weren't a subject of the king anymore. You were le citoyen, a citizen of la patrie, the fatherland. They created new symbols like the tricolor flag we know today to replace all the old royal stuff. And then they unified the whole country with one set of laws, one system for weights and measures, making the nation something you could actually feel in your everyday life. And then, this guy Napoleon shows up. As his armies marched all across Europe, they carried these revolutionary ideas with them. But here's the great paradox. At the same time he was exporting ideas about liberty, he was also hitting people with heavy taxes, censorship, and forcing them to join his armies. So in a weird way, he spread the idea of the nation, while also giving other people a really good reason to create their own nations just to stand up against him. But listen, nationalism wasn't just built on battlefields or in government buildings. For it to really take hold, it had to be built in people's hearts and minds. And for that part of the story, we have to turn away from politics and look at culture. This quote here from the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder really gets to the heart of what we call romantic nationalism. The Romantics believed that a nation's true spirit, its Volksgeist, wasn't something you'd find in a palace or with some general. No, it was out there with the common people, that's folk. And that meant that suddenly culture itself became a deeply, deeply political thing. And they had a whole toolkit to make this happen. What was in it? Well, you had people collecting old folk songs and poetry from tiny villages. You had folk dances, like the Polish Polonaise and mazurka, being turned into these grand national symbols. They pushed for a common language to replace all the different local dialects. And they even created these powerful allegories, these female figures like Germania, to give the whole abstract idea of a nation a real human face. And here's the perfect example, the brothers Grimm. We think of their fairy tales as bedtime stories for kids, right? Well, at the time, it was way more than that. It was a political project. They were on a mission, traveling from village to village, trying to collect these stories, to define some kind of pure, authentic German spirit that could resist the cultural power of Napoleonic France. So that liberal dream of 1848, that springtime of peoples we saw in the first image, it ultimately failed. And what came next was a lot more pragmatic. and a lot more ruthless. Nationalism was about to be taken over by the state. Yeah, after those liberal revolutions got crushed, the conservatives swooped in and basically hijacked the nationalist project. And the poster child for this new approach was Otto von Bismarck of Prussia. His whole philosophy wasn't about the people uniting. It was about state power. He famously said that the great questions of the day would be decided not by speeches and majority votes, but by iron and blood. For him, the real nation builders were the army and the government bureaucracy. And man, just look at how fast it all happened. This wasn't some slow cultural evolution anymore. We're talking about just over a decade where that old patchwork map of Central Europe was literally forged for a series of quick, decisive wars into two brand new powerful nations, Italy and Germany. But it's so important to remember the gap between the elites pushing for this stuff and the regular folks on the ground. There's this famous, almost funny story about the unification of Italy. Leaders were rallying peasants to fight for Italia, but a lot of the soldiers had absolutely no idea what Italia was. They thought La Talia was the name of the king's wife. It's a perfect little story to show how, for so many people, the nation was still a completely foreign idea. And that brings us to the final and, frankly, the most tragic chapter in this story. Because in the last part of the 19th century, something inside the idea of nationalism really started to go sour. That early, idealistic vision of a whole family of free and equal nations, it was fading fast. And in its place, a much more aggressive, much more competitive nationalism started to rise. It became less about being free and more about being dominant. The whole focus shifted from uniting people at home to competing with everyone else abroad. And the flashpoint for this new, dangerous nationalism was a region called the Balkans. You basically had a perfect storm. The old Ottoman Empire was crumbling, which created this massive power vacuum. You had all these different Slavic peoples struggling to create their own nations, often competing for the same piece of land. And on top of all of that, you had the big European powers like Russia and Austria-Hungary, all meddling and trying to increase their own influence. The whole area became what history calls a powder keg. And so that's it. The tragic transformation is complete. The noble cry of "my nation is free" gets twisted into the ugly shout of "my nation is superior." The ideal of a family of nations, of fraternity, gets replaced by fierce rivalry, and in the end, war. The logical conclusion of this dark turn was the disaster of 1914, when that Balkan powder keg finally exploded and dragged all of Europe down with it. So look, the idea of the nation created our modern world. It gave us democracy, citizenship, a lot of the things we take for granted. It's an idea that has inspired incredible art and truly heroic sacrifice. But its history is also a warning. It shows us that this idea has a profound danger baked into it. It forces us to draw a line between us and them. And the most important question it leaves us with, a question that is just as real today as it was then, is simply this: where do we draw that line?